Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Friday, so let's all quit. It's Friday, February 4th, 2022. Happy birthday to my brother, who's next up in the birthday calendar. I'm front-loaded on the birthdays in this family, so happy birthday. I don't know if you're listening anymore these days. When you had more time in the mornings, it used to be the case. A lot of driving around, but a busy guy these days. Nonetheless, happy birthday. And I would shout your name out, but you know who you are. And also security, and I don't want anybody else blaming you for this show. So you know how it goes. I give you cover on that one. So let's see. Good morning. It is Friday, end of the week, and, well, we have about 1,000 stories left. So no shortage. Don't worry about that. That shouldn't bother you at all. We, of course, can begin with Bill's tweet this morning. He was featured prominently in the Morning Post today, as a matter of fact. But the Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now. Kagro X says it's Friday. I have done that. That's good. Check that one off. And while others disagree, that can't be right. This evolving situation is raising eyebrows and in certain circles, but no statements have been issued as of yet. Okay, very good. I know there's a dispute about this. I don't know. I could be... I'm disputing this with Bethany Mandel this morning. I don't know. She's back in front of the crowds making a spectacle of herself today. I don't know. Angry about something. As it turns out, I guess her complaint today is she homeschools her kids, and she took them to the library. And what's this? Jay Willis found this particular complaint annoying and unpersuasive, and I think I agree with his assessment here. Jay Willis tweeting, "Call me a cynic, but I simply do not find this persuasive." Must have grabbed this from her Substack or something. I don't know why people subscribe to Substacks that they disagree with so much, but it's content, so here you go. Oh no, this must not be her Substack because it refers to her in the third person. I don't know where they grabbed this from. Mandel, a convert to Orthodox Judaism who homeschools her 5 children, said she was disturbed, which I agree with. That's true. When one of her children stumbled upon... I fell on this book, Mom. I stumbled upon The Breakaways, a graphic novel. Not a, lurid and graphic novel. A graphic novel. A graphic novel about a middle school soccer team that includes a character who is undergoing a gender transition. Okay, and I don't know that that's like the centerpiece of the story or anything. But, okay, there you go. And she says, it kind of spooked me a bit. Woo, boo, I'm Jan Dringer. Yikes. So that's what she said. It kind of spooked me a bit. I don't feel like I can go to the library and have my children pick out a book anymore. Well, you can't have them stumble on it anyway. It's not that Mandel has a problem with LGBTQ identities, she insisted. It's that she wants to discuss human sexuality with her children on her own terms. And she thinks there are millions of other parents who feel the same way. That's her biggest problem. She's constantly feeling that there's millions of other parents that feel the same way as she does. But I don't know. Not the most offensive thing that she's done even this week, probably. But it did strike me as interesting and contrived, I think. And I think that's what Jay Willis might have been hinting at here. You know, my children found an LGBTQ character in a graphic novel in a hipster coffee shop in LA, kind of thing. This is a real setup. But I just, I don't know. The whole thing struck me as odd because, of course, here she is a homeschooler. And, I'm a homeschooler. It's just as good as going to regular public school or even a private school. I teach my kids at home. Now, my school doesn't have a library. But that's okay, because all the rest of you have funded and built the library for me, and I have now gone there, and guess what? I don't think I like the books that you've decided to put in the library that you paid and built for the use of everyone. I thought that was kind of weird. That shouldn't they have checked with Bethany or every patron of the library, and I suppose people could say, well, it's a public library, she's a taxpayer, presumably, unless, of course, she's forging her tax papers, like they do with electoral votes these days. And, yeah, I mean, she's one voice among many, but she has a Substack, so now we all have to listen to her. And sounds to me like other parents might have said, I'm okay, A, with this book, or B, okay with the librarians picking the book. And it's also interesting that they stumbled across. Do you mean they came back from the Dr. Seuss section and said, Mommy, I want this book, and oh my goodness, it's too old for you because it deals with middle school topics and you're a grade schooler, and that would be understandable. Or the stumble across. My question is, was the stumbling across really stumbling? Was it really one of the kids that stumbled, or was it I was bringing my kids to the children's section, and on the way we passed by the young adult section, and there was a book that either caught my eye or was out on display, or I just happened to see, or I heard about from a right-wing discussion circle, and I went to see if my filthy, disgusting library had it, and then I picked it up. But it's a more compelling story if my children find it, and it's even more compelling if they stumble upon it. Anyway, I don't know. The whole thing sounds rather contrived, and but here we are with the libertarian-ish homeschooling people who just want everybody to build them private libraries and stock them the way they like. And by the way, I don't have anything against these people. I just want to discuss sexuality in my own way, which is to say, wait 25 years and not discuss it and send them off in the world on their own. And, we'll get around to it in sex ed class, homeschool sex ed class. That must be fun, huh? Anyway, whatever. No more attention for her. She's dopey. I don't like her. But that's what's happening, and people are talking about yada yada. So, all right. Well, dismiss that and move on to the other fun and or important stuff. Plenty of things that we had to leave aside during the week, and doubtless things that will come up along the way. Let me see. I should note for the record, I saw lots of chatter about this yesterday, but I didn't park the articles until I was reminded this morning that the story had been circulating, and I ended up parking here another story about something happening here in the United States covered by The Guardian. I've chosen to grab their article about it as I saw this recirculate, but making an important point. So we should be aware of it. Makes for good weekend conversation fodder. You may already have heard from another source the story of Pamela Moses. As it says here in the headline in The Guardian, not really the most sensitive of headlines. So, the black woman sentenced to 6 years in prison over a voting error. Now, she didn't forge any electoral college certificates, which seems like the biggest voting fraud there could possibly be. It's like a super vote, right? But no, 6 years in prison, so I guess all of the fake electors have that to look forward to. Pamela Moses was sentenced to 6 years in prison for trying to register despite a felony conviction, but officials admitted making a series of mistakes. And apparently the judge thinks all the mistakes are hers. But anyway, a weird situation. Might as well catch up on it. Definitely a big topic of conversation, and just shows the disparities in the way we treat people who might be, say, of different colors, maybe, in this situation. What do we got here? And this is an interesting way of approaching the story. This is Sam Levine writing this story, and what an interesting format we begin with here. Hello, Fight to Vote readers. I guess this is an ongoing series of articles. For the last few months, I've been following the case of Pamela Moses, a 44-year-old activist in Memphis who was convicted in November for trying to register to vote while she was ineligible. By the way, why was she ineligible? She was ineligible because she has in the past been a convicted felon. One of these states that will strip your rights to vote permanently, which is really interesting. I don't really understand exactly I mean, I know the justification. I don't know what the legitimate justification for it is. The justification for it is, well, I'm a black man, and if they're white, sometimes we'll restore their right to vote, or they just don't matter because they're poor white people and we don't count them, whatever it is. Sometimes you can get your rights restored, sometimes not. But I guess they put it on the books so that they can justify keeping people off the voting rolls if they don't look right to them. But, if you get sentenced even to, 6 years in jail or something, for some other crime, not trying to register to vote, then, if you do your time, then I guess you should get your voting rights back afterwards. But no, that's a life sentence. I always found that weird and counterproductive and hard to justify. Like, honestly, if somebody gets out of prison and they go out of their way to say, I'm going to integrate back into society by, doing my civic duty. Like other people are, who are never been convicted of anything, but probably should be, running around saying they're solid citizens, but I just don't like voting. It's a big waste of time. I'm not going to do it. And they don't vote, and they don't show up for jury service, and maybe they even cheat on their taxes as well. And they say they're solid citizens. Somebody gets out of jail and they say, I'm going to go on the straight and narrow path and I'm going to vote. Because I don't think anybody says, I am going straight back to crime, but I am voting. I mean, I guess somebody must. There's a lot of people in the world. Eventually you'll find someone who'll do that. But to go through the process of registering and paying some attention and saying, I care about the community. And why shouldn't you, by the way? I think it's rehabilitative. And I've been doing a lot of reading about this. Help me out, radicalization people, right? If you get released from prison and society just says, you're done with paying your debts to society, but you still stink. We still don't want you around. We still don't want you to be a part of this society. Even if we want you to go on a straight and narrow and work hard and keep your nose clean and what other metaphors? Keep your nose clean, and then after you're done cleaning it, put it on the grindstone and work hard and play by the rules. And, but why would you if you also are excluded from society of any decision? I mean, it's not like societal decisions don't affect you because you were once a felon. That's not even that societal decisions don't affect you while you're in prison. Honestly, I'm not sure there's a great reason not to allow prisoners to vote. I know people then say, well, they lost their rights and that's why they're in jail and it's a good reason and that's something of an argument. But also, I don't know what the big fear is. Are they worried that they'll be like, I'm going to vote for my ex-partner in crime and I'm going to make him, let's say, head of the elections board. Well, is that worse than the QAnon nut that's the head of your elections board now? Or I'll vote for a criminal for president. Well, you're too late for that. You're not the first one who thought of that one. There's nothing, there's no criminals union or anything like that. There's no way to wield collective political power as part of a crime syndicate, really. I guess you could worry that, these people in prison are crime-minded and maybe have access to the material. I don't know. They forge ballots. They could forge electoral votes. That's probably something. Look, if they can make license plates, they can make electoral college certificates, right? I really don't know what the justification is. So I'm against that one. But then again, at least in theory, I also question the wisdom of not allowing permanent residents, non-citizen permanent residents to vote too. Because again, if you're here and you're participating in our society, you mean to make this your home, permanent resident, and you're working and you're paying your taxes, I don't see why you shouldn't have some voice in the direction of the government. I understand that you want to have some, qualification. Like you can't just, just show up and then say, I'll live here I say I'm going to live here for a while. I might even say I'm going to be a permanent resident. Like China can't send 10 million people and, on a mission to register to vote, and then move back to China or something like that, or even stay. But with instructions to vote as the Chinese Communist Party wants you to, or something like that. Why, if you want to do things that way, you stay in China and do it, by God. You can't come here and do it. Make us waste all that ink on writing your name on the voting rolls. Anyway, doesn't really make a difference. Because apparently there's millions of people who are willing to vote the line of the Chinese government or the Russian government at their will anyway. Okay. Anyway, so none of this makes any sense. That's my political science corner on this one. But where were we? Ah, yes. So, Pamela Moses, 44-year-old activist now, in Memphis, convicted in November for trying to register to vote while she was ineligible. On Monday, Moses, who is black, still, that's the way we started this story, and she still is, was sentenced to 6 years and 1 day in prison. That was the FU day that they threw in at the end there. That's interesting. To my eye, the case is far more complex than it seems, which is why we're asking your eye about this, Sam. Amy Wyrick, the local prosecutor, has trumpeted both the conviction and the sentence in press releases. It's a voter fraud conviction. So it's like a big deal. It's in the news. I guess, I don't know if she's Republican or not, but she's looking for Republican votes, I guess. She has highlighted that Moses, and it's a tough thing to prosecute Moses is, she's highlighted that Moses has an extensive criminal record, now even more extensive, thanks to you, and she told a straightforward story about Moses' voting crime. In 2015, Moses pleaded guilty to perjury and tampering with evidence in connection to allegations that she stalked and harassed a local judge. Not good. Tampering with evidence is one of a handful of felonies that causes someone to permanently lose their voting rights in Tennessee. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Nonetheless, Moses, still on probation, knowingly tried to register to vote in 2019, which is a fine way of protesting, even if you know you're ineligible. I don't know whether, I guess Tennessee, is this hinting that they don't strip your voting rights for just anything, one of a handful of felonies? And I suppose tampering with evidence, I mean, if you were to say on the grounds that maybe you would tamper with the evidence that you're eligible to register to vote and therefore be committing more fraud, I guess I would say counterfeiters, maybe? You don't want to, I don't know. But even so, you're talking about a fairly small number of people. Not swing votes, I would say. But okay, the case caught my attention for a few reasons. First, it is rare to see a prosecutor bring criminal charges against someone for election crimes. That's usually because there aren't any. And I was curious whether this was a bona fide, as we say, case of fraud or someone who had made a mistake. Everyone wants to know. Second, there has been a growing awareness of racial disparities in punishments for election-related crimes, also every other crime. But this is the focus. Black people such as Crystal Mason and, I don't know this one, Hervis Rogers, I don't think I'm familiar with his case, who has faced, they both have faced years in prison for making mistakes about their voting eligibility. White voters who have received much lighter sentences, they've often received lighter sentences for election-related crimes. Wyrick's office did not respond to interview requests, but the more I looked into Moses' case, the more I realized the case wasn't straightforward at all. Ooh, it's getting interesting now. Behind the scenes, Tennessee officials conceded that they had made a series of mistakes concerning Moses' voting eligibility. In 2015, when Moses pleaded guilty to her felony, she says no one told her she couldn't vote. You really should add that as part of the sentence in court. Maybe they did. Maybe she missed it. I don't know. They never mentioned anything about voting because it probably never occurred to them. They probably just thought she never voted anyway. They never mentioned anything about voting, being able to vote. None of that, Moses told me last year. She added she hadn't discussed the case with her two sons, 24, eligible to vote, and 13, but described it as traumatic. At the time, election officials should have removed her from the rolls, but the court never sent election officials in Memphis the documents they needed to do so, according to a letter from an election official that I obtained. Obtained the letter, not the election official, though they are for sale. Moses didn't know anything was amiss until 2019. Which is kind of their own fault for not sending that. And then maybe the voting rolls people would have sent her a letter that says you've been removed. But then she launched a long-shot mayoral campaign. Good for you. I mean, does sound like a long shot. You kind of just got out of jail, but it's sort of a Donald Trump sort of, maybe it's 2019, it's Trump inspired, right? The only way to either expunge my criminal record or rehabilitate myself or continue my criminal activities, if that was the motivation, is to run for and win public office. That's the best protection you can get. Maybe she thought mayors could pardon people. I don't know. Or maybe she just thought, this place sucks, and even as an ex-con, I can run this place better. And maybe she should have been Trumpy. I alone can fix it. I know the criminal system from the inside. And if you want to combat crime, the person you need in office is a criminal. Like they usually, I'm going to balance the budget. You need a business person. We've got to put a businessman in the White House. Let's put a criminal in the mayor's office, because why not? Well, she's not a career criminal. Now they would say she is, because she's been convicted of something else as well. But I don't know. I'm not certain what the motivation was. But what the hell? It couldn't be any worse than the other people they have running for office in so many other places. You got QAnon nuts. All right, let's do it. Election officials said she couldn't appear on the ballot because of her felony. When they began to look into her eligibility, they also realized she had never been taken off the voter rolls. Moses went to court and asked the judge to clarify whether she was still on probation, and the court confirmed that she was. What happened next is at the crux of the case against her. So, all of you crux collectors, listen up. Moses did not believe the judge had correctly calculated her sentence. Well, when you give out sentences like 5 years in one day, I can see how that could happen. Well, is one of those years a leap year, or what's the story here? So, she went to the local probation office and asked an officer to figure it out. Fine. An officer filled out and signed a certificate confirming her probation had ended. All right. In Tennessee, people with felony convictions who want to vote need that document from a corrections official. So she got it. Moses submitted it to local elections officials along with a voter registration form. But the day afterwards, an official at the corrections department wrote an email to election officials saying a probation officer had made an, quote, error on Moses' certificate. Moses was still serving an active felony sentence, they wrote, and was not eligible to vote. The department offered no explanation for the mistake. Okay, like even whether it had been made or anything, like, okay, we made a mistake. What was the mistake? Well, we put down the wrong thing. Well, were you right the second time? I had no comment. Such errors are actually fairly common in Tennessee, where they don't know how to count or don't know what words mean. You can see how this could happen. Where the voting rules are extremely confusing for people with felonies, so it's not really to blame the officials necessarily. Blair Bowie, an attorney at the Campaign Legal Center, was behind this comment, saying that it was fairly common and things are confusing. A 2017 study found that about 8% of the certificates submitted were rejected because the voters remained ineligible. Bowie said she was unaware of any voter in the state ever facing criminal charges for submitting a certificate, but later turning out to be ineligible to vote. Maybe this is the first one. During Moses' trial, prosecutors argued that she knew she was ineligible to vote when she submitted the certificate. They pointed to the fact that she submitted it even though a judge had recently told her she was ineligible. But that she double-checked and got a different answer the second time. Like, not unlike Glenn Youngkin's kid, who went and was told he was ineligible to vote, but then went back for a second opinion. Although that time they gave him the right answer. No, you're still ineligible to vote. You haven't turned 18 since you were here last, have you? No? But, okay. Even knowing that order denied her expiration of sentence, Pamela Moses submitted that form with her application for voter registration and signed an oath as to the accuracy of the information submitted. Prosecutors wrote in their request for an indictment, Pamela Moses knowingly made or consented to a false entry on her permanent registration. You tricked the probation department into giving you documents saying you were off probation, the judge sentencing her said last week. Well, that seems absurd to me on its face, said Bowie, and said me. who is involved in a challenge to Tennessee's process for restoring voting rights. That part is just buoy. The instructions on the certificate of restoration form are very clear to the probation officer or the clerk. They say you will check these records and you will sign off on this based on what the records say. They're saying that she tricked the probation officer into filling out this form for her. That creates a really scary prospect for people who think they're being wrongly told that they're not ineligible, right? Everybody can go and get the paperwork that they're entitled to. And now you got to worry, is my probation officer stupid or wrong or tricking me on purpose, trying to get me put back in jail by saying I'm eligible? How do I trust this official document? You can't now. Okay, that's great for, stability in society. Moses is currently in custody and an appeal is expected, but the case highlights the Byzantine maze that people with felony convictions have to go through to figure out if they can vote. And it shows the harsh consequences prosecutors can bring if people with felony convictions make a mistake. And that's actually the end of the article, I think, here, although it also shows the weird consequences that can come when felony conviction, or the people with felony convictions make a mistake, but people who are supposed to administer the sentences of people who with felony convictions make a mistake instead. And who goes to jail? Well, it's the person with the felony conviction for some reason, as opposed to the officer who, I guess, they probably signed a document, an official document with a signature and everything attesting to the accuracy of the information. Are there perjury charges or forgery charges of some kind, any kind of charges at all against the probation officer? Probably not. And I don't think that would necessarily be appropriate unless they did it knowingly. But what a weird case. Just one of many. I know we've heard the names mentioned, at least Crystal Mason's name before. I'm going to look into this Hervis Rogers case. Maybe during the break. We'll be right back. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Rich Radio. Okay, there. Shook it up a little bit, huh? I don't know. It's totally different. Okay, so, the case now, as I mentioned before the break, Hervis Rogers, I guess it does sort of ring a bell now. I don't know why it's not, it's a pretty unique name. Maybe I didn't catch the name the first time around, but that story comes from Sam Levine's, well, the link goes to Sam Levine's earlier reporting, this from July 9th, 2021. Texas man who waited 7 hours at the polls is charged with voting illegally. That kind of sucks. Not a great reward for sticking in there. Hervis Rogers became a national symbol of tenacity when he cast his ballot in last year's presidential primaries. Was he like the last guy in line or something? Well, you're under arrest. A Texas man who became a national hero after he waited 7 hours in line to vote in last year's presidential primary has been arrested and charged with voting illegally. Hervis Rogers, who is black, he's very fond of that phrasing, Sam Levine, but okay, became a symbol of determination to have one's voice heard. I wanted to get my vote in, voice my opinion, he told a local ABC affiliate after his long wait to cast his ballot in the 2020 election. I wasn't going to let anything stop me, so I waited it out. That's what we tell people to do. I mean, granted, it's not what Republicans tell people to do. Not, people who is black, as Sam Levine would say. But he'd probably get the plural, construction correct. Anyway, but on Wednesday, back in 2021, July. According to Houston Public Media, he was arrested and charged with 2 counts of illegal voting. 2 counts. How many ballots did you cast? 1. How many counts? 2. Are you sure you can count? Do you know what count means by anyone? Anyway, the Texas Attorney General, who probably should be arrested himself, Ken Paxton, not just for this, but for other things as well, is reportedly bringing charges that allege Rogers voted while on parole for a 1995 conviction for burglary and intent to commit theft. I meant to do another one. I just didn't get around to it. In Texas, it is illegal for anyone convicted of a felony to vote until they complete their sentence, including probation and parole. Rogers' parole began in 2004 and was set to expire in June of 2022. But the Texas primaries were held in March. So, I don't know, dramatic music for that, perhaps? All right, but, March isn't June. Fine, but still, yeah, you're probably walking around saying, well, my parole ends in 2020. Hey, that's an election year, so that's good. I'll probably vote in that election year. And you might even have been thinking at the time, oh, yes, my probation or parole ends in March, or in June, so might not be able to vote in the primaries, but definitely be voting in the general election. Then maybe he became worried. Now, if he was a Florida voter, he would say, what if we have a universal primary and there's no... But probably not the case for a presidential race. But he may have been thinking for years, oh yeah, 2020 is the year I get to vote again. Fantastic. Can't wait to integrate myself back into that part of society. And then maybe, I don't know, maybe he forgot. Rogers, though, cannot afford $100,000 in bail, and so is therefore being held in jail, at least back when this article was written, said Thomas Buser Clancy, an attorney with the Texas chapter of the ACLU, which is helping represent Rogers. Good for you. The arrest and prosecution of Mr. Rogers hadn't occurred to me, but not something I thought I would be reading this morning. The arrest and prosecution of Mr. Rogers should alarm all Texans, in fact, the entire neighborhood. He waited in line for over 6 hours to vote to fulfill what he believed to be his civic duty and, to vote. To fulfill, I would say, what he believed to be his civic duty. He wasn't voting to fulfill it. It was fulfilled by the voting. And is now locked up on a bail amount that most people could not afford, said Andre Segura, the legal director of the Texas ACLU, in a statement. He faces potentially decades in jail. Our laws should not intimidate people from voting by increasing the risk of prosecution for, at worst, innocent mistakes. We really do need to give another look at this. And reconsider what we're doing with felons, and particularly, I would think, people on parole. If you can, look, if they're on parole and then they voluntarily register with the state again for another thing, and there's no punishment involved in it, but they give their name, they show their proof of identity, they give their address, it's a way of checking up on their stable return to society. We really must be doing everything we can to change those laws and to encourage people who have been released, whether it's because their sentence is totally complete or they're on parole. This is a good thing to do, and we should be encouraging people, sign up for this, sign up to, whatever, anything we can get you to sign up for that is a public function and a civic duty. Really ought to be part of the, they ought to teach you that in prison so that when you get out, you know exactly what to do. Christopher Downey, a criminal defense attorney, told KPRC Rogers, I'm having trouble reading today. KPRC 2. That's the name of the channel that was told. Okay. Anyway, Downey told the TV station that Rogers' 2 felony convictions, you see what I'm reading here? He told KPRC 2 that Rogers' 2 felony convictions meant he could face a more severe prison sentence on the illegal voting charges, potentially 25 years to life on each count. That's crazy. They should be locking up these prosecutors. I guess that's his 3rd strike. Is that what's going on here? Jeez. Few prosecutors have pursued election-related crimes more than Paxton, because he's a jerk. A Republican himself under FBI investigation, by the way, regarding allegations of bribery, which he denies, and who filed a long-shot lawsuit at the U.S. Supreme Court trying to overturn Donald Trump's election defeat in 2020, which, by the way, should be considered election fraud. You knew it was baseless at the time, right? And you tried to reverse the actual outcome of the election. You just went directly at that. This guy wanted to cast one of millions of votes and do things the normal way. You wanted to go over everybody's head and reverse the outcome of the election, even though you knew that your case was a fraud, or should have, and I think you should be in jail for that, quite honestly. Even as Paxton publicly has touted the number of cases his office has been involved in, a 2019 HuffPost review found that most involved relatively minor infractions. So he's arresting the jaywalkers of the election crimes world. His office did not immediately respond to a request for comment about the Rogers case. Rachel Hooper, a Republican precinct chair in Harris County, filed a formal complaint in March of last year saying Rogers was ineligible to vote. She obtained a copy of his voter registration application through a public records request and noted that he had signed a statement indicating he had completed all punishment for a felony. The form contains the warning that at the bottom of the application. In an email to The Guardian last year, Hooper wrote, as a former prosecutor, I want to give them the opportunity to investigate and take action. As a voter, I just felt a sense of obligation to file this complaint after learning that Mr. Rogers was in violation of Texas election law, which, granted, she's taken a take more seriously than others because she's an elections official. Although, you're not supposed to do that on the basis of who you think they voted for because of what color they are. You know. Like, I don't know, maybe you should have judged him on the content of his character. Say, all you guys insist, in this month especially, that you're into that. Totally into that. Anyway, Hooper provided a copy of Rogers' certificate of parole from May of 2004. The document contains a lengthy description of instructions for people on parole, but does not say they cannot vote. You probably didn't expect that they would, but all right. An estimated 5.2 million people cannot vote in the U.S. because of a felony conviction, according to an estimate by the Sentencing Project, a criminal justice nonprofit. Each U.S. state has its own rules. Maine, Vermont, and the District of Columbia allow people convicted of felonies to vote while they are in prison. And you can see what hellholes they are as a result, too, right? Oh, my God. It's the worst. You got guys handing out nuts to squirrels like willy-nilly out there. They're feeding squirrels like it's free in Maine. You got to put a stop to this. That's the way it ought to be, quite honestly. I don't know what it is about being in prison that means you shouldn't vote. I don't know if a lot of people are taking the opportunity to do it, but anyway, I don't know. I mean, I've made the argument already, but I don't know, it just suddenly like popped into my head. Like, okay, like it doesn't occur to anybody. I don't know what the connection is. They're bad people, so they'll vote for bad people. Well, then, they're only going to vote for people who are on the ballot by virtue of having been nominated by you guys. All right, they're not organizing petition drives to put people on the ballot. Now, they could put a write-in ballot in there, but, that's not going to work. I'm voting for, my favorite criminal in here, my role model. I can't wait to get out and start murdering like he does. I don't know. I don't know what they're afraid of. And it occurs to me, like, there's certainly no harm that can be done. You can't say this voting is just going to encourage them to keep living the thug life when they get out. As opposed to say, I don't know, putting people in prison, rightfully, let's say, for assault. They're running around starting fights and punching people and hurting them. And now they're in jail and nobody thinks twice about, would you like to be able to lift weights while you're in here? And, continue to do some bodybuilding, build up the strength so that when you're clobbering people again, when you get out, you can do it even more efficiently. That we're like, well, we have to give them something to exercise on while they're in prison. And that's all true. But I mean, like, nobody ever thinks that's weird. But, oh, you're going to let them vote. That's crazy. I don't know. It just seems to me like if you did both, then maybe they would get out and they would say, well, instead of going out and punching people because I'm angry that they won't let me vote or participate in society in any level, I could be healthy and strong and integrated into society and speak my mind and voice my opinion about how you ought to sentence people to shorter sentences for things. Whatever. I don't know. It's still, I can't find the logical basis for it. Anyway, so it's bad news. Mason was, I skipped down to Crystal Mason's case here. Sorry, at the bottom of this, I think we were sidetracked by the fact that Maine and Vermont and the District of Columbia are so fantastic with their prisoners. Several other states allow people convicted of felonies to vote once they're released. Others, like Texas, require people with felonies to complete their entire sentence before they can vote. And that's not so kooky if you make the decision that prisoners can't vote. Like letting you out on parole is about what? Creating space in the prisons? Although I think they try to justify that by saying we're trying to also slowly integrate people back into society with a little check on their activity. But then why not let them vote? Texas, what are you going to do? So, and you know what the real answer, of course, I keep forgetting. Oh yeah, well, it's racism. Geez, I forgot about that. Okay. Well, yeah, okay, I now remember. Such a mix of systems makes it extremely confusing and difficult for anyone who has a felony to figure out if they're eligible to vote. You can't just ask your friends like Glenn Youngkin's kids did. In 2017, a Texas prosecutor made headlines for bringing criminal charges against Crystal Mason, a black woman in Fort Worth who cast a provisional ballot in 2016. Provisional ballot. While she was on supervised release for a federal tax fraud felony. That's the kind that Donald Trump likes. That makes her smart. What's the problem here? Mason was convicted of illegal voting and sentenced to 5 years in prison, a sentence many saw as overly harsh. Probation officials conceded they had never told Mason she couldn't vote. Her provisional ballot ultimately went uncounted, so what's the problem? No harm, no foul, they would say if she were Republican. The case is pending before Texas's highest criminal appellate court, back at the time this was written anyway. Republicans in Texas and elsewhere have moved aggressively to implement new laws to make it harder to vote. The Texas legislature started a special session on Thursday, way back when, in which it was expected to impose new requirements in mail-in voting and empower partisan poll watchers, among other measures. So there you go. The article was amended on July 11th, 2021, because an earlier version said that Hooper filed a complaint saying that Harris was ineligible to vote, and the intended reference was to Rogers. Oh, okay. Well, that doesn't matter much because they got it right in our reading. Wow. All right. So, yeah, it's bad. It's happening everywhere. And we did a little political science there, too. I don't know. That's something I think I'm completely on the side of changing that. And I think Maine and Vermont and D.C. have it right on that. And I guess politicians probably afraid of, who's going to campaign for prisoners' rights. It's not typically a popular position, but it would be interesting to do in debate if you were debating somebody who really would debate, as opposed to saying that guy hates God, right? So, you're not going to win that debate. All right. What else have we got here? How about this? The next thing up in the pocket is here, and it's ominous sounding, and I can't remember what it was about it that made me put it away in pocket, except that maybe it was ominous sounding. Biden versus Trump, the makings of a shattering constitutional crisis. That's right, shattering. Yes, and why not just press all the buttons that are next to dramatic music here, like the Trump fart.
We found a way in other states later. Excuse me.
Trump farted. Anyway, Biden versus Trump. I guess every time we say Trump,
we found a way in other states later. Excuse me.
Yeah, we found a way to in other states later to fart in other states as well. Biden versus Trump, the makings of a shattering constitutional crisis. January 2025 could make January 2021 seem tame by comparison. I remember now. I read through this and I thought, I don't remember what I thought exactly. Bruce Ackerman and Gerard Magliocca, Magliocca, Magliocca. I don't know. That's not the point. He wrote it. I'm sorry I mispronounced it. Gerard, because I think we all know Bruce Ackerman. I don't know if you knew that he was the Sterling Professor of Law and Political Science at Yale University. but, he's got a sterling reputation as well. Gerard Magliocha, I don't know, I'm sorry. But I do know that he's the Samuel R. Rosen professor at the Indiana University, Robert H. McKinney School of Law, .edu.gov.com. Goodness. 20 minutes later, we're ready to read the article. Donald Trump, who sucks, I'm adding that part, is already signaling that he will run for president in 2024. A Biden-Trump rematch risks worsening our country's already deep divisions. But there's more to be worried about. There is. The next election will provoke a genuine constitutional crisis unless decisive steps are taken soon to prevent it. So I think this is another one of those calls for changes in the Electoral Count Act and any other number of other laws that governing the certification. I think this is basically, though, one of those articles that says, what if they just don't do the thing they're supposed to do? What are we going to do about that? And it's good to raise these issues. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the Disqualification Clause, expressly bars any person from holding, quote, any office, civil or military, under the United States, if he or she or they, right, quote, engaged in insurrection. What kind of insurrection? The kind that's against the Constitution, after previously swearing to uphold it as an officer of the United States. These terms definitely apply to Trump, and some Democrats are exploring the use of Section 3 against him. We also have, I think, mentioned the story that somebody is suing to keep Madison Cawthorn off the ballot in North Carolina under a similar provision, although actually something specific to North Carolina. And he has some interesting defenses about that, too. Let's see if we can squeeze that into the show. But what about using Section 3 of the 14th Amendment against Trump? The text is framed in exceptionally broad terms, prohibiting service in any of the states as well as the federal government. It does permit a candidate for future office to escape disqualification, but only by obtaining a vote of 2/3 of each house. These congressional supermajorities, one of the few places where they actually do mention supermajorities in the Constitution, these supermajorities, however, are obviously beyond Trump's grasp, unless, of course, they forge the vote results. That can be done. Which means once he announces his presidential campaign, it won't be possible for him to avoid a confrontation with the 14th Amendment. Before he can run for the Republican nomination in the primaries, he must convince each state's election authorities that Section 3 doesn't bar him from the White House. And I could see that being actually a tough slog to convince anybody that it does apply to him. Oh, yeah, it's in there, I know, but that's not what they meant. And how do you know this was an insurrection? They were talking about the Civil War, and I could see some elections officials just saying, no, this was a high school prank, not an insurrection. A lawsuit filed in January in North Carolina provides, here's the news, a model for future proceedings against Trump. A group of registered voters, and I'm sure they'll try and say they shouldn't be registered now, have invoked the 14th Amendment to disqualify Representative Madison Cawthorn from running again for a seat in the House in 2022, based on his support for the January 2021 riot at the U.S. Capitol. They are relying on a provision of state law that authorizes them to raise a, quote, reasonable suspicion that a would-be candidate is legally unqualified for the office he is seeking. That is interesting. If the voters can convince the state's elections authorities that their suspicions are reasonable, the burden of proof will shift to Cawthorn, who must establish, by a preponderance of the evidence, that he is eligible. The congressman will have a full and fair opportunity to demonstrate before an impartial fact finder, maybe, that the charges against him don't have the necessary support. Trump's case is no different, except that he will be facing similar challenges in all 50 states. While not all states will address this issue the way North Carolina does, they all require their elections authorities to make an evidence-based decision about whether candidates are eligible to run for a particular office. It isn't necessary to delve into these complexities, however. Oh, yes, it is. We'll delve. But it's not necessary to delve into them to know that once Trump announces his candidacy, his lawyers will be confronting multiple challenges to his qualifications on a nationwide basis. One thing is clear. It is virtually impossible that all 50 states will come to the same decision. I don't know. I could see them all blowing it off. Anyway, instead, some elections authorities will disqualify him, while others will conclude that the facts are insufficiently compelling to justify his exclusion under the 14th Amendment. And this means that in 2023, the nation will be split into two parts. In the constitutionalist region, Trump will be disqualified. In the insurrectionist region, the local electoral authorities will validate him as a legitimate candidate for the Republican nomination. You can imagine the scene. For the rest of the campaign season, Trump will organize massive rallies in the insurrectionist states, while Democratic opposition in these states will respond with counter-demonstrations. Violent confrontations may well result. At the same time, Democrats will mobilize against Trump in the constitutionalist states. We'll see. And Republicans will passionately defend him. This will dramatically reinforce the polarization dividing Americans. Election day will escalate these tensions. Trump supporters in constitutionalist states won't see his name on their ballots. Instead, they'll likely see, this is an interesting thought, they'll likely see the name of a proxy candidate whom Trump has designated as his stand-in to deprive Biden of his electoral college majority. The stand-in's name will be proof to Republicans that the vote count has been rigged against Trump from the start. In contrast, Biden's supporters in insurrectionist states will be outraged by Trump's defiance of the 14th Amendment. The constitutional crisis will escalate further once the polls close and each state decides who won the election. Under the Constitution, the states send their electoral college reports directly to the vice president, even the forged ones, I guess. Once she, and that's the correct answer now, once she receives them, Kamala Harris will preside over a joint session of Congress on January 6th, 2025, the 4th anniversary of the insurrection, to count the votes. Once she inspects the ballots, and I don't know how much inspection goes on from the vice president themselves. Anyway, she is likely to find that none of the leading candidates, neither Biden nor Trump's proxy, has won a majority of the electoral votes. That's really up to the tellers, but okay. At that point, she will confront little-known provisions of the Constitution that will make Mike Pence's predicament on January 6, 2021 seem modest by comparison. They involve the 12th Amendment, ratified when Thomas Jefferson was in the White House to remedy serious difficulties that arose in his presidential contest with John Adams 4 years before. Yet the rules ratified 2 centuries ago will have devastating consequences in 2025. For starters, the amendment gives the job of choosing the president exclusively to the House when there's nobody with a majority. The president chosen by the House while assigning the vice presidency to the Senate. It explicitly provides, moreover, that the House will apply a special rule for selecting a president if no candidate gets an electoral college majority or one candidate forges the electoral college votes or whatever. You know this one. When this happens, the votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. This gives the single representative of Wyoming, by the way, population about 600,000, a little less, especially now after COVID, the same voting power as the 50-plus representatives from California, where the population is over or near 40 million. This rule will certainly be invoked when Harris opens each state's ballots. She will report that the electoral vote is split 3 ways, if that's what happens, with no candidate receiving the necessary 270 votes. That won't be the end of the matter. Democrats will immediately challenge all the votes coming from insurrectionist states, because Donald Trump was allowed on the ballot and shouldn't have been under the 14th Amendment, while Republicans will be denouncing the constitutionalist submissions because they excluded Donald Trump. Simply obtaining a decision from the joint session may well be a long, drawn-out affair, especially, of course, since the joint session can make no decisions. They would have to split up, go back to their respective houses, make the decisions separately there, come back and see what they got. After that, the House may need repeated invocations of the 1 state, 1 vote rule to choose a president, which could take months. I think they would probably do it pretty quickly, but okay. And a Senate minority could filibuster the selection of a vice president indefinitely, especially if Trump's running mate is also subject to disqualification under Section 3. And what will happen to the presidency in the meantime? Well, the Presidential Succession Act of 1947, passed at the insistence of Harry Truman, provides the answer. It says that if by reason of death, resignation, removal from office, inability, or failure to qualify, there is neither a president nor vice president to discharge the powers and duties of the office of the president, then the Speaker of the House shall, upon his, his resignation as Speaker and as representative in Congress, act as president. So there you go. I guess there's the answer, by the way, about why Trump, quote unquote, can't occupy both offices, except if he just does. But anyway, I don't know. Still, no discussion in this article, by the way, about the prospect of making Donald Trump Speaker of the House, although it would make for an interesting backup to their plans here to, force it to a vote of the House. If something were to go wrong there and Democrats were able to find a way to block his ratification as president in the voting of the House, if it would come to him by default as Speaker of the House, that might work. Anyway, so if Joe Biden's term expires on January 20th, 2025, before Congress has designated a clear successor, the Speaker becomes acting president until the House acts decisively. That's right. Acting! You got it. All right. So, we got our break coming up here. So maybe the exciting conclusion comes after that. But it's true, we can probably say this. This is a recipe for disaster. America will be governed by a temporary caretaker president, unless that's Donald Trump because he's Speaker of the House, while Democrats and Republicans denounce each other's nominee on Capitol Hill. Not only will this provoke massive street demonstrations by militants on both sides, as if there were, but it will also invite foreign adversaries to take advantage of America's paralysis with aggressive power plays. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. All right, let's jump back here. Oh, what's going on here? I just want to check in on what the Blue Virginia account is tweeting about. Ah, yes, someone asking, anyone sensing a pattern here? And it's the public schedule for the governor, Glenn Youngkin, here in Virginia. Event after event after event, closed to the press. But okay. Public schedule, but just not for you. Okay. I should have saved that so that you could all see it for yourselves. But you know what? We won't even bother. Well, do I need to link to it? Take my word for it. That's what his schedule says. It's no big deal. Okay. Back to the next constitutional crisis description, or continuing with the one we were already in progress. Now back to the constitutional crisis previously in progress. Two scenarios are possible if the House eventually chooses a winner. Both are terrible. Under the first, all House Republicans will vote for Trump. And since Democrats are concentrated in highly populated states, this means that Trump may go to the White House under the special one state, one vote procedure, even if Biden has won a clear majority in the eyes of neutral observers. The House will then degenerate into chaos as Democrats accuse Republicans of stealing the election, provoking bloody battles throughout the country. That reminds me, I'm thinking about the one state, one vote thing. And, while it's generally assumed that Republicans will control enough delegations, I'm just wondering what happens. I'm not sure what the mechanism for the voting is. Do the state delegations caucus separately, canvass their members, and then come back with the result? Or, I'm just curious about how it works. Or do they all stand on the floor and everybody casts their votes, but then they're grouped by states and the tellers figure out what the vote of the state is based on the individual votes of every member, or what? I'm curious about what the mechanism is. Maybe CRS knows. We can look it up. I don't think I'll Joe Rogan this one just yet, though there is an hour left in the show. And I shouldn't give Joe Rogan that much credit. I was researching things and looking up what the hell I was doing on the fly on the air before he was, or maybe at the same time he was, or maybe after him. I don't know how long he's been on the air, but he sucks and I don't. So that's why I get credit for it. So I'm curious about the mechanism, and I'm also curious about states that might be evenly divided as between Democrats and Republicans. I guess there's not a whole lot of them. There's only 50 to begin with anyway. But is a tie indeterminate? Do they say no vote is cast by the state? Or I don't know, is there a tie-breaking mechanism? Or is it, I don't know. So I'll ask CRS at some point. But I was just wondering what if, the circumstances were such that, I guess that's why it's still an if. Like, what if you couldn't get a majority of the states to vote for one or the other of the candidates because one or two states are tied and we just take them out of the mix and then you can't get to 25 states or 26 states or whatever it is. And does D.C. get a vote or not? Does everybody with electoral votes get to vote? I don't know. We haven't used this thing. So, Anyway, the other grim possibility is that Democrats will simply walk out of the House proceedings in protest against the Republicans' failure to respect the Disqualifications Clause. I don't know where that gets you. So, therefore, it's probably like 50-50 that we would do that. Trump and Biden will both present themselves to Chief Justice John Roberts on January 20th to take the oath of office. But so will the Speaker of the House. How will Roberts resolve his trilemma? And what happens if the Speaker of the House is Donald Trump? Then just Trump and Biden present themselves to Chief Justice Roberts. But Trump says, I get to present myself twice. So I get 2 votes. It's 2 for me and 1 for you. I win. Swear me in. American history provides no precedent. And in this case, that would mean that you had no president. Yet he must choose. How will Sophie Roberts choose? Will other government officials accept his choice? That's an interesting question. Again, getting us into the realm of, well, I'm just not gonna, and maybe being on the side of, I'm just not gonna, depending on what the outcome of this decision is. Most importantly, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff must agree with him. There's no provision of law that says, well, check with the Joint Chiefs or anything. What they mean is, otherwise, if the Joint Chiefs of Staff don't agree, and I don't know that the chair has any particular power in this or any influence over the other Joint Chiefs, or whether the Chiefs have any influence over what chaos that you're talking about here. But what they're hinting at here is, if the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff doesn't agree with the decision that Chief Justice John Roberts, if he's still Chief Justice at the time, could be in fragile health, who knows? Could get COVID from Gorsuch. Anyway, but if they don't agree, right, or they say, this guy's crazy, he made the wrong decision, what if the armed forces decides, at a minimum, it doesn't mean that they're going to conduct a coup and take over the country, but what if they don't agree with the decision on which one gets sworn in, and the military somehow follows that lead and says, we think the other guy is commander-in-chief? That would be something. Now, unless the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or any military authority for that matter, agrees with Roberts, Democratic and Republican loyalists will demonstrate throughout the nation, and even if they do agree, they might, insisting that their candidate rightfully belongs in the White House. American democracy may never recover from the collapse of the rule of law. This particular collapse, anyway. In an ideal world, Congress would enact federal legislation to create a special judicial panel to determine, after a full and fair hearing, whether Trump led an insurrection in 2021. I don't know. I mean, I get the idea here, but there needs to be some adjudication to it. In an ideal world, Congress would enact federal legislation to allow me to decide. That would be my ideal. And I'd do a great job. But okay, a judicial panel to determine, after a full and fair hearing, whether Trump led an insurrection in 2021. Rather than waiting for him to declare his candidacy, the tribunal should be convened immediately and make its decision expeditiously so that it could be reviewed by the Supreme Court by the end of this year. Even if the panel or the court decided in favor of Trump, this would be far better than to split America in two. And that covers the objection that, well, of course the Supreme Court will rule in favor of Trump. They might, but at least that would be better than having it be a question mark in terms of stability. I mean, we might all just, you know how Democrats are. That decision sucks, but I guess that's what it is. Republicans would reject their decision the other way, which would undoubtedly color their decision-making because they're a political body. Even if they weren't already inclined to favor Trump, they would say, well, you know how it is out there. They're gonna think the court is illegitimate if we rule correctly against him. Yet, under real-world conditions, a Senate filibuster will doom any such statute. Only the Supreme Court is in a serious position to intervene in a decisive and timely fashion by granting expedited review in a case, like Cawthorn's, that could serve as a vehicle for a broad-ranging opinion defining the standards that apply to Trump as well. This will permit a timely challenge to the qualifications to proceed in federal court. Maybe. Of course, they could very well find that Madison Cawthorn didn't have nearly the level of involvement that they might be looking for to nail him for participating in an insurrection, whereas Donald Trump certainly could. But, you know, handling his case might hone the blades just a little bit so that when somebody eventually sues over Trump's candidacy, they know what to do. To be sure, this will require the conservatives on the Supreme Court to confront their own moment of truth. Dun, dun, dun. They won't do it. Yeah, you know, I have the music for this one. This will require the conservatives on the Supreme Court to confront their own moment of truth. Yeah, that's the music that more likely follows, I think. Too bad about that weird bit of distortion in that sound effect. Anyway, if they live up to their, quote, originalist creed, they cannot allow Trump to escape scrutiny under the Disqualifications Clause. Yeah, they can. By the way, they'll say, well, I'm an originalist. This gobbledygook is from an amendment. The 14th Amendment isn't the framers doing. It's some other losers. And we don't accept that. It's over 50 years old, like OSHA. Anyway, so if they live up to their originalist creed, which they won't, they cannot allow Trump to escape scrutiny under the Disqualifications Clause. The framers of the 14th Amendment repeatedly made it clear that Section 3 raised a matter of fundamental principle. Quote, no man who broke his official oath with the nation can be, quote, again permitted to hold a position in the national government, said Representative John Bingham. Mr. Bingham himself said this, the principal framer of the 14th Amendment. These framers refused to allow leading insurrectionists like, Jefferson Davis, for instance, to escape disqualification. At the very least, Trump should be required to make his case before a judicial tribunal in Guantanamo in a fact-based fashion. Indeed, Justice Neil Gorsuch, that guy who's going to give him COVID, authored an opinion in 2012, it's linked here, that should be interesting, that explicitly upheld a state's legitimate interest in excluding presidential primary candidates who are constitutionally prohibited from assuming office. How interesting is that? What's the opinion? Hassan versus Colorado. Hassan, or is it Hassan? No, it is Hassan. Abdul Karim Hassan. Okay. Very interesting. Running for office. Presidential candidate. Running in Colorado. Upholding a Colorado law requiring all presidential candidates to affirm that they are natural-born citizens, about which I guess people suspected in Abdul Karim Hassan's case. He may or may not be. I don't know anything about the case. But an interesting decision, an interesting precedent for Gorsuch to ignore while he gives everybody COVID. Will he and his fellow conservatives redeem their own commitment to the framers of the 14th Amendment by taking a case onto their docket that makes it clear that Trump cannot put himself above the Constitution? Or will the court pretend that nothing extraordinary is happening and allow the country to stumble into the abyss? The answer is number 2. They will pretend that nothing extraordinary is happening. That is what they do. And we'll stumble into the abyss. So, looks like a fun abyss. Sounds interesting. And at least we'll get an answer out of it as to how will the votes be counted by state in the House of Representatives. I'd be very curious to find out. Do they go back to the model of the Continental Congress where each state caucus, had to come up with its answer among themselves, and then their spokesperson, their foreperson or chairperson, I don't know what they called the person who would stand up and speak and cast the vote for that state. And I don't know if that really even happened or it was just in 1776, the musical, that way. I got no idea. But that's my historical record as far as I know. We could look it up, but we only have so much time. All right, let's see. I think there was also a very interesting looking piece from Greg Sargent the other day. This one I haven't had a chance to skim, but I don't know. There was something about the way it was being distributed and bandied about and talked about that made me think it might make interesting fodder for the show. As Trump rages, a new plan to prevent a 2024 coup quietly advances. That's very nice to know. Although, yeah, lots of back and forth among people discussing the issues on Twitter and elsewhere about, will a revision of the Electoral Count Act really stop somebody who's willing to say, well, I'm just not going to comply with the law. I'm just going to do this other thing instead. And you're going to have to find a way to make me not do it. No, it might be, it's not foolproof. We may still have to enforce the law. But better off with a clearer law in hand when you get to court. Why? If only because it becomes that much more embarrassing in our view, if not theirs, for the conservative justices to ignore or totally rewrite the law right in front of all of us. Here's what Greg had to say back on Groundhog Day. So it's a little bit like we're doing this one over and over again. In a welcome turn of events, a new plan to Trump-proof, and that's in quotes, Trump-proof the 2024 election is advancing in Congress. Surprisingly, it appears to have some Republican support, although we're curious about why that is, or whether that's just one of those decoy support things in the early stages. It's bipartisan, all right, and then when the time comes, nope. Anyway, Donald Trump is in a fury over it, so that's good. The plan in question concerns reform of the Electoral Count Act of 1887, which governs how Congress counts electoral votes. Senator Angus King, there's another Maine connection for you, has introduced an Eca Reform Bill, and a bipartisan group of senators is negotiating another version. This is what Joan had mentioned to us, I think. These seek to patch holes in the ECA that Trump relentlessly tried to exploit to overturn his 2020 loss, which may be why Trump has issued 2 statements raging about these efforts. Is that why he was ranting about crazy Susan Collins? What's darkly amusing here is that Trump himself is making the case for ECA reform as powerfully as anyone could want. He is telegraphing with absolute clarity his intention to rerun his effort in 2024 if the conditions are there for it. As it turns out, a close look at the specifics of these ECA reforms shows that they actually would help thwart, maybe, Trump's 2024 designs. Let's see why Greg thinks they would. Trump's unabashed corruption is first. It's always first. That's the name of this section anyway. Given the disordered jumble of corruption and malevolence that characterizes Trump's mental universe, I think that was it. Somebody was commenting on the fine turn of phrase when they were circulating this article. Again, given the disordered jumble of corruption and malevolence that characterizes Trump's mental universe, it's hard to pin down his thinking, but Trump is tipping his hand. For instance, Trump's latest claim is that the mere fact that we're debating ECA reform shows he was right in saying his vice president should have invalidated Joe Biden's electors, kicking them back to the states. They could have sent sham electors overturning Trump's loss. Trump's thought is this: because one facet of ECA reform would clarify that the vice president has no role in counting electors, this must mean that Mike Pence did have the power to refuse to count them. It has now been shown that he clearly had the right to do this, Trump raged in one statement. He insisted the only reason January 6th happened at all is because Pence blinked. Trump also fumed that Pence should have, quote, overturned the election, which was an unfortunate turn of phrase if you're a Trump attorney, but whatever. For the rest of us, it was just an admission. In other words, the attack Trump incited on our government was a righteous effort to correct a grievous wrong done to him and his supporters. The move to reform ECA proves it. Pence did have the power to correct that wrong, but didn't use it. By doubling down on this unabashed stance that exploiting the ECA to keep him in power illegitimately would have been the right thing to do, Trump has strengthened reformers' hand. In flaunting his corruption, Trump has clarified the debate. Opposing ECA reform is now firmly aligned with making it easier for him to pull off a rerun next time. I guess this just leaves aside the other stuff. But it's important to get the details right. We'll see what the details of the ECA reform are next. But I would just remind everybody, no, the fact that they are revising the ECA to add an extra no, you can't do this doesn't mean it could have been done before. It was still against the letter of the law and unconstitutional for the vice president to assume a role that isn't discussed here. But the fact that other people said, well, it doesn't say he can't, means he can. No, it just means it doesn't say that he can't. We may also find that he actually can't, but for other reasons. But now we'll put in there a line that says he actually can't, so that you can't say, well, it doesn't say he can't. Now it does say he can't. Okay, well, that just proves that he could before. No, that just proves that there was room for allowing a stupid question to be asked, but we could still dispense with it by saying, nah, he still can't, because this government delegates power to federal authorities explicitly, and all those things that aren't delegated explicitly don't authorize those things to happen. Just as, there's a whole constitutional amendment that says that any powers not therein granted are reserved to the states. No power has been granted to the vice president in this or in statute. That means he can't do it by default, not that he can. Now, that's at least one way of approaching things. But the fact that not everybody agrees is reason to clarify, but it doesn't establish that there was one right answer from before. It just highlights the fact that there was disagreement and then settles the disagreement. It's a dumb argument, but you knew it was dumb because Donald Trump was making it, even if you couldn't put your finger on why it was dumb. I'll do that, but then I'll wash my finger. What ECA reform would do is our next section. King's proposal would clarify the vice president's role as ceremonial, which is necessary. But that isn't what would thwart a coup rerun, because on January 6, 2025, Kamala Harris will presumably be vice president. However, other things in the King proposal likely would thwart a future attempt. One danger is that a single GOP governor and or state legislature could send a fake slate of electors, like they did, to Congress, defying a Democratic popular vote win in a state set to decide the election. I'll clarify here, though. No Republican governor or state legislature, for that matter, actually faked a slate of electors in 2020. That was... Sometimes there were state legislators who were among the fake electors, but no state gave any official imprimatur of any kind, whether from the state legislature as a whole or from the governor's office, to any of the fake slates. So we can't accuse them of that. And by the way, let me just jump back to the first paragraph of this, where it said King's proposal would clarify that the vice presidential role here is ceremonial, which is necessary. Different meaning of the word necessary in my head here. It's necessary, he's saying, to define the role as ceremonial. It's not that it's necessary that the vice president perform that role, ceremonial or otherwise, which just raised, that's why that different interpretation, wrong one for this circumstances, but it brought up a suggestion that I've seen circulated recently. And what was it? Oh, yeah, that there's really no reason that the vice president actually has to have that role. It could easily be performed by the less obviously partisan, though still partisan appointed clerk of the House, or it could be the tellers that do it, although they're, members of Congress, so maybe they're just as suspect as the vice president and all that. But you could have the House clerks and the Senate clerks, for that matter, since it's a joint session, have the clerks do the reading and the opening of the envelopes and the determination that everything is regular in form, et cetera, et cetera. There's no reason why the vice president has to do it. It's just somebody who's recognizable. And back in the olden days when people believed things like, surely somebody who's the vice president of the United States, that sort of important personage, would never simply lie about the contents of the certificate for political gain. And that's, meant to put a face to that we recognize. And fewer people recognize the clerk of the House. But if you're watching on C-SPAN and they say, this person is the clerk of the House, that should be enough, especially if the job is reading what's on the paper. Then they might be perfectly qualified to do that. I don't know. Anyway, I just wanted to recognize that. I think it was Ira Goldman, our Twitter friend, KD by proxy, who mentioned that most recently, that the job could be handed to somebody else. Anyway, not terribly important, but just something to keep in mind. Why not? If we're in the middle of reforming the Electoral Count Act, we could make that reform too. Anyway, where were we with this? Oh, yes, right. There was the danger that this time around a governor or state legislature could try to give its imprimatur, to use the $5 word for it, to a fake slate of electors, defying a Democratic popular vote win in a state set to decide the election. Just outright say, yeah, Biden won Arizona, but Doug Ducey says, I'm signing the other certificate. Because what's the penalty for signing it? I don't know. Nothing. A GOP-controlled House could then count those sham electors. Although, again, that would be an interesting thing. If since they do the states in alphabetical order, there's a way to determine ahead of time whether that certificate is going to be handed to a Democratic teller or a Republican teller. I guess it's 50-50, the odds, but you can determine by the order, since everything's done in alphabetical order, but ahead of time without knowing which state it's going to be. It's 50-50 that will be handed to a Democrat who will say, this is fake. I'm not reading this thing. And I don't know what happens when that goes on. I guess there's an objection and they split up for a vote. So, ultimately, yes, a GOP-controlled House could count those sham electors. Under the current Electoral Count Act, a single slate only gets tossed if both chambers vote to invalidate it. In that scenario, the Republicans might win. We don't know who will control both houses at the time. We'll have to see. So, the King bill would trigger a new process of judicial review if electors are appointed in defiance of a state's previously existing procedures. When courts declare those electors invalid and validate the winner's electors, the King bill would require Congress to count the right ones. Although, again, where does it break down? It's along the lines of, well, we're just not going to do it. The King bill requires Congress to count the right ones. All right, well, we're not gonna, and we're going to vote on it. And what do you know? Republicans are in the majority, and we're just not going to do it. And then the Supreme Court says, it's one of their rules of procedure, and it's their prerogative, and I don't know whether we can intervene. It's a feedback loop. Anyway, the right principle here is that once courts have spoken on who the valid electors are, Congress's hands are tied. Matthew Seligman a legal scholar who specializes in the Electoral Count Act, told me they have to count those electors. Now, I don't know that they really do, but Seligman knows what he's talking about generally. I'd be curious what his opinion is on why they think they could force this thing. Even if there was a writ of mandamus from the Supreme Court, it would be one branch against another. I don't know that they would be forced to count things the way they don't want to count them, so long as they have a majority. Maybe the idea is that some people would get weak in the knees and be swayed by the law. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, the same guy who was just talking to you a second ago. Our Patreon subscription drive is still going strong, with over 175 monthly donors who help keep us on the air. If we've helped keep you going during the pandemic, why not return the favor and help us keep going so we can all be together for the next disaster? Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it easy to make secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for keeping you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We literally could not do this without you. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. By the way, I looked up whether there was a Congressional Research Service report on how voting would work if there was an electoral tie or something like that, and the House had to decide who the president was. And there is. And it was updated, I guess the newest one I found was updated in October of 2020, I guess, when people who had been wargaming these things had decided that, the Trump plan is to try to create enough confusion to somehow maybe possibly invalidate or otherwise suspend the counting of some electoral college certificates such that there was a tie or no candidate with a clear majority of electoral votes, and throw it to the House and have the Republican majority among the state delegations throw the election to him. So they did analyze it. I'll put it aside for the moment so that we can continue with the Greg Sargent piece and finish that up. And I don't know, maybe it could be a thing where I say, I'll read it over the weekend and tell you later, and tell you more news rather than read you a CRS report. But if you want to read the CRS report over the weekend, I'll give you that too, in the roundup. All right. So where were we? Yes, right. Seligman saying, he thinks it's possible that you could, in fact, make it mandatory that the House has to accept the correct electoral slate. And I'm not so sure. Another danger, a GOP-controlled House and Senate could refuse to count the state's legitimately elected, appointed electors. Is that not the same danger? So King's bill would raise the threshold to invalidate electors from a simple majority to an elusive 3/5 in both chambers. That's what Joan told us about. A bipartisan group also appears to be supportive of such a fix. And that one worries me a little bit for a different reason. I'll see if I can remember to get around to it in a second. But again, I guess this is an approach to fixing the problem the objection I have to Seligman's insistence that you could just be forced as a member of Congress to count those electors. Although it comes from another angle. That's why it's listed as another danger, is that you could simply vote to say, well, no, we're not gonna. But instead, I guess this would raise the threshold. You'd need 3/5 or 60 in the Senate, right? But you need 60% vote, 3/5 in both houses, in order to sustain an objection to counting an electoral college certificate. So it's not quite as easy. And then there was also, I know Joan had mentioned, what about raising the threshold in order to lodge such a challenge in the first place? That was a little bit more worrisome. But both of them together, these two safeguards, will make it harder to throw out an electoral college slate. The weakness of it, or the danger in it makes itself apparent when you start going back to thinking about, well, what if it all begins at the stupid level of the state saying, we're just not going to send the right certificate in the first place. So the certificate that shows up from the state is the one that says Trump wins, and that's the one that's presented in Congress. And now Democrats find themselves in the position of having to be the ones to object to the validity of the document and counting it along with the others. And then they say, well, you need X number of members of the House and X number of the members of the Senate in order to even get to a vote on your objection. And then when you get to the vote, you got to get 3/5 of the chamber to agree to throw this thing out, even though we all know it was forged. We all asked for it to be forged. Or, whatever. Whatever the circumstances are. And now the higher threshold is backfired against you. So I don't know exactly what to do with this. But, but it's difficult to predict because it all goes back to what if a bunch of people, like the Republican Party, just say, we're not going to do the things that you say we have to, and we're not going to abide by the law or Constitution. I'm making my air quotes, but that's my air quote voice. You know what I'm doing here. But okay. Luckily, a bipartisan group also appears supportive of such a fix, and surely Susan Collins will come through for us on that one. The differences between now and the last time are crucial, Greg Sargent continues. In addition to pressuring Pence, Trump tried to get state legislatures to send fake electors, not it's up to them, and got dozens of congressional Republicans to object to Biden electors. Both failed, but now Trump is supporting many candidates for state-level offices who have pledged fealty to his 2020 lies and likely would execute such schemes in 2024. His gubernatorial candidate in Georgia is running on an implicit promise to do just this. And Trump should say, it's not enough for me, by the way, that your promise be implicit. I've had somebody explain to me what the difference is and what implicit is. Turns out it's the opposite of explicit, which is my favorite form of pornographic material. So I remember it that way. I have a memoronic device for this. So anyway, it's not enough that this be implicit. I've made my promise, for instance, I'm switching out of character. I've made my promise to pardon January 6th rioters explicit. You now need to do the same in order to maintain my support. Why not? He should. And they'll gladly give it to him, too. If a corrupt Secretary of State or governor does help send fake electors, do you doubt that a Speaker Kevin McCarthy would count them? I don't. By the way, would you doubt that a Speaker Donald Trump would count them? I don't think so. But I think Kevin McCarthy would probably do the same. ECA reform would cut off these pathways at a time when Trump himself is telegraphing his intentions to exploit those pathways. And even if it doesn't, you should pass it anyway because it'll just be that much more embarrassing for them. So it's heartening that some Republicans appear supportive of reform. Here, a mea culpa. Let's see. I recently suggested, Greg says, that if Trump opposed reform, it might become impossible for Republicans to support it. So far, that isn't happening. Well, wait until voting time happens. So, what will Republicans ultimately do now that Trump himself has confirmed that opposing the ECA reform is tantamount to enabling him to execute his corrupt designs? We'll see, but it would be amusing indeed. Amusing indeed. If Trump's flaunting his own corruption ultimately helped push them to action. Amusing and a little bit surprising. All right. Well, very interesting and well worth our time just to get a chance to examine the various proposals for reforming the Electoral College or Electoral Count Act, and just a couple of warnings where that could all fall apart. And right in front of your face is the answer to that. Speaking as we were earlier of the case against filed against Madison Cawthorn. Mark Joseph Stern, staff writer for Slate, who you might see frequently on Twitter, notes this case and says there's an interesting defense being offered here. Among other things, he says, in the middle of a conversation, I guess, held elsewhere, among other things, Cawthorn argues, and remember what's being argued here, people have filed suit saying the 14th Amendment, Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, would disqualify Cawthorn from being on the ballot in North Carolina because he supported an insurrection, the insurrection of our lifetimes anyway, and should therefore not be allowed on the ballot. And I guess apparently the rules in North Carolina about ballot access questions being determined make it particularly difficult for him to deal with the case. If a valid presumption is found that he indeed supported an insurrection, then the burden of proof in North Carolina law switches to him to prove that he should survive this disability, as they call it, which is no pun intended, the fact that he's actually in a wheelchair as well. But maybe they could come up with a different word for it. Or we've already come up with a different word for physical disability anyway, so we should have adopted that instead. Okay. Anyway, Stern points out here, wish it was Howard Stern, it would be more fun. Among other things, Cawthorn argues that he is protected by the Amnesty Act of 1872. It's starting to get like Goodwill Hunting-ish here, which Congress passed to let former Confederates hold public office again. Did you realize that they had done that? Let's see, what does he include? Oh, he's including the pleadings from the Cawthorn case. But I'll read also, there's an embedded tweet here from Will Duran, North Carolina politics writer for the Charlotte News Observer, right, who, I guess, kicks this discussion off. A news story this morning. It was about the filing of the case. Madison Cawthorn is trying to stop the challenge that, if it does happen, could end up with him testifying under oath about his role in the January 6th attack. That's the other interesting angle in all this. We accuse you of having supported the insurrection. Well, I deny it. Okay, well, then we'll now have you testify under oath and be cross-examined about your role. You can continue to deny everything, but of course, if you're lying, and we're able to prove that, then we have you on perjury charges, and that's good too. Well, anyway, Cawthorn says it violates his constitutional rights to use the Constitution to try and keep him off the ballot. That's interesting. There's many parts of the Constitution. I'm surprised he didn't say it's unconstitutional to use the Constitution to keep him off. Anyway, let's see. There's a detailed report in the News Observer about it and Cawthorn's response, which might be more clarifying than just reading from the pleadings and using their legalese. But let me see. Is there more to Stern's thing here? He doesn't have a thread or anything. It's just so interesting. So there's some other source documents here. Let's start with the organized thoughts of the piece in the News Observer. Madison Cawthorn sues North Carolina to stop inquiry into his role in the January 6th attack on Congress. This is interesting. So somebody, I think the chain of events here, you file to keep him off the ballot because insurrection support. So they're seeking an inquiry into his role to determine whether or not he supported it enough to be able to determine that he supported an insurrection for the purposes of the invoking the Disabilities Clause against him. And he's suing to stop the inquiry so that they can never make any such determination. All right. That's where it now stands. Whose piece is this? This is Will Duran's own piece. North Carolina Representative Madison Cawthorn, whose eligibility to run for re-election to Congress is being formally challenged, has now begun his legal fight against that effort. He's always in court, this guy, by the way. North Carolina, we read that part. I thought that was, they were saying it again. No. Aside from a blanket one-sentence denial, Cawthorn does not address the allegations against him. namely that he supported and possibly even helped plan the January 6th, 2021 attack on Congress by supporters of Republican President Donald Trump attempting to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Rather, his lawsuit says the North Carolina State Board of Elections has no authority to keep him off the ballot in the first place. Who would then? And so the challenge against him should be dropped, and the state law allowing for such challenges should be ruled unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional to try to invoke the Constitution. Running for political office is quintessential First Amendment activity and afforded great protection, his lawsuit says, and that's probably true, but it's not the only part of the Constitution. Cawthorn, a Republican who represents Western North Carolina, has created a national following among the far right wing of his party. In an interview with the conservative Daily Caller website on Monday, the same day he filed the lawsuit in federal court, Cawthorn advanced the conspiracy theory that the January 6th attack was conducted by the FBI or other parts of the Trump administration to discredit Trump. That is a weird thing. There were members of the federal government who were deeply involved in this, he said. Yeah, that's why they're suing to get the North Carolina State Board of Elections to disqualify those members of the government who were deeply involved in it from being allowed to run for office. But that's not what he meant. Those challenging his eligibility said that if any members of the government were involved in the attack, it was actually Cawthorn and potentially other GOP politicians helping far-right militias and other groups plan the attack. Specifically, they say there's reason to suspect that Cawthorn was involved in planning efforts to intimidate Congress and the vice president into rejecting valid electoral votes and subvert the essential constitutional function of an orderly and peaceful transition of power. He should have to undergo a deposition to answer questions about his role in the attack if he wants to be able to run for office again, the challenge states, something Cawthorn's lawsuit Monday says violates his constitutional rights. Well, what happened on January 6th is, okay, I think we know. Should we skip this part? Does it set up any of this stuff? I'll say this. Numerous Republican politicians, including Cawthorn and most of North Carolina's other Republican lawmakers, voted to do what the mob wanted, but the challenge against Cawthorn singles him out for having gone a step further. It says that at the very least, he encouraged the crowd that day to get violent. He does tend to talk that way. And he potentially also worked directly with organizers of the attack beforehand to help plan it. Trump, Cawthorn, and others on the right claim there was widespread fraud in states that Trump lost. However, they have never been able to prove it, despite massive amounts of attention and money, including over $500 million taxpayer dollars spent on unsuccessful efforts to find fraud. This next section is entitled Confederates and Civil Rights. The challenge against Cawthorn's eligibility is based on the 14th Amendment, and specifically a section of it that was intended to bar former members of Congress who fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War from returning to Congress after the war. But the amendment is most famous for different sections guaranteeing civil rights protections, like due process to all Americans regardless of their skin color, and Cawthorn cites those protections as a reason why the other section, banning those who engaged in an insurrection against the government from holding office, should not apply to him. Specifically, he says it's because of the way the state law is worded. When candidates are accused of being ineligible for office, the state puts the burden of proof on the accused rather than the accuser. That's the opposite of how it works in criminal trials. That's something. Here, Representative Cawthorn is required to produce countervailing evidence to prove a negative, i.e. that he did not engage in an insurrection, based upon nothing more than the challenger's, quote, reasonable suspicion, the lawsuit says. Such a burden-shifting requirement as applied to Representative Cawthorn here violates his constitutional rights to due process under the 14th Amendment. They included the word clause here, and I don't think that they meant to do that. That's just force of habit when you say due process, to say due process clause. But it doesn't violate his constitutional rights to due process clause. It violates his constitutional rights to due process under the 14th Amendment. Poor writing, but not an invalid point. The challengers against Cawthorn, led by two former North Carolina Supreme Court justices, have hoped to use the state's process for determining a candidate's eligibility to force Cawthorn to testify under oath about his role in the January 6th attack, since the burden is on him to prove that he is eligible. Well, it is kind of interesting. Shifting the burden of proof. I mean, it's not a criminal... I don't think it's a criminal proceeding, right? It's a civil proceeding, and he's not... Is he deprived of life, liberty, or property? I don't know. That's a tough thing. That's not tough. It's a tough thing to make a case for, to say that the burden can't be shifted, that it's unconstitutional, because he's not facing a criminal punishment here. His First Amendment rights to speech remain. I don't know if there's necessarily a First Amendment right to ballot access, though. It's a kind of speech. But, all right. Well, I see where they're going. They sort of have something there, but it'll be interesting to see how it gets hashed out. Anyway, in his lawsuit filed in federal court on Monday, Cawthorn does not go into any details about that day or his actions leading up to it. He says his lawsuit is not intended to defend against those accusations, but rather is seeking to stop the process before it even gets to that point. Representative Cawthorn vigorously denies that he engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the United States, but this litigation is not based on Cawthorn's factual defenses, the lawsuit says. Instead, this matter is before the court based upon various constitutional and legal challenges to the North Carolina challenge statute itself and its application here. And that's got better footing than trying to claim that the 14th Amendment is unconstitutional. That isn't going to help you. But the burden-shifting provision of the North Carolina statute could be unconstitutional. At least, it's a normal-ish question. The formal process to deal with the challenge against him was supposed to have started already, but it's been delayed while a related lawsuit over the shape of North Carolina's political districts plays out. That case is scheduled for oral arguments at the North Carolina Supreme Court on Wednesday, which I guess already happened because this article is dated when? February 1st. So Wednesday, 2 days ago, they would have had oral arguments about the redistricting. Okay. Where did we leave off? I want to scroll back down here. There we go. In addition to the constitutional rights violation that he alleges, Cawthorn also says the anti-Confederate piece of the 14th Amendment can't be used against him or anyone else still living. He cites a law passed in 1872. That's too late. I'm sorry. The Supreme Court doesn't like anything that's over 50 years old. The Amnesty Act, in which Congress decided to allow some Confederate rebels, former Confederate rebels, to serve in Congress. He says it did keep a ban on former members of Congress who had served between 1859 and 1863 and later fought in the Confederacy, but it allowed all others who had participated in insurrection against the U.S. government to serve in Congress despite their actions. So he concluded that the ban shouldn't be able to apply to him or anyone else. Cawthorn addressed the challenge in his interview with the Daily Caller. It seems so asinine on the front of it, he said. The face of it? Is that what we're talking about? To think that something created for the Civil War is going to be used for what happened on January 6th, when I did my constitutional duty to certify an election. No, it doesn't seem absurd at all, or asinine, on the front of it. Something created for the Civil War is also going to apply to other insurrections. You just think that the thing you did wasn't an insurrection. Cawthorn voted against certifying the results of the election, of course. So that's the totality of the article about this. Now, I don't think there's any more that we need to grab from Will Duran on this. But back to Mark Joseph Stern, he included some other documents here, I guess, from the court filings. I have count 4 here. The challenge section, as applied to Representative Cawthorn under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, violates federal law, he contends. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, of course, the Disabilities Clause. You've heard it before, but he's got some bolding in here, some emphasis. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress, or elector of president and vice president, importantly, or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or any state, now the emphasis, who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress, or as an officer of the United States, or as a member of any state legislature, or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof, but Congress may, by a vote of 2/3 of each house, remove such disability. Of course, it goes on to say, Congress does not have the power to, quote, repeal a constitutional amendment, but the plain language of the amendment itself gave Congress the power to remove this particular political disability. The Amnesty Act of 1872 reads, and it's going to cut off here, all political disabilities imposed by the 3rd section of, let's continue, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States are hereby removed from all persons whomsoever, except senators and representatives of the 36th and 37th Congresses, officers in the judicial, military, and naval service of the United States, heads of departments, and foreign ministers of the United States. The plain language of the 1872 Act removed the political disability of Section 3 from any representative other than those of the 36th or 37th Congresses. Representative Cawthorn is a member of the 117th session of Congress. Just Congress. 117th Congress is the way of saying it. So the 1872 Act removed the ability to apply Section 3 to Representative Cawthorn. Since Section 3 does not apply to Representative Cawthorn or any member holding office after the 37th Congress, the application of Section 3 to Representative Cawthorn is prohibited by federal law. It is a possibility, although I would now want to read the act and find out whether it was specific to removing disabilities imposed by participation in the Civil War. I don't know that it removed the disability with respect to all future insurrections. I doubt very much whether that was their intention. If there is ever another Civil War, and who would be more likely to think that there could be another one than the generation that just fought one, I doubt very much whether they said, we don't need to disqualify insurrectionists from office in future civil wars. That's their problem. As it happens, somebody in this Twitter thread has provided the Amnesty Act of 1872. He says it's surprisingly short. I guess that's how they did things back in the day. Let's take a look at it. It is pretty short. It's like a paragraph. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, 2/3 of each house concurring therein, that all political disabilities imposed by the 3rd section of the 14th Article of Amendments to the Constitution of the United States are hereby removed from all persons whomsoever. Well, okay, I guess that is, we read that, right? Except senators and representatives of the 36th and 37th Congresses and other officers, and foreign ministers of the United States. Approved May 22nd, 1872. So I guess that's a problem, right? And that they put it that way. All persons whomsoever. Of course, those persons whomsoever didn't exist at the time of the writing of this act, but, well, we'll have to give that some further consideration and see what people think about that. Certainly the intent of the framers of the law could be held in question here, and I guess you could probably try and retrieve some of the debate surrounding the adoption of this act and see whether there was any mention of the fact that they meant it to apply to future insurrectionists as well. I have my doubts about that, but it'll be interesting to see that play out in court. So want to dig into the weeds? That's what we do here on the show, and boy, did this get weedy. All right, there's some other things, too, that I didn't get to before. I'll read this thing about the Congressional Research Service, about how voting works in the House. when the elections get thrown there. More reporting today, this one from Hugo Lowell, in yet another Guardian article, but more updates on proof of things that we already thought had happened. Revealed, Trump reviewed draft order that authorized voting machines to be seized. We knew that he was handed a draft order, but now we have proof that, he actually read the thing and started to take some action on it. Might even have thought it was being executed as he spoke. But anyway, we'll have to check in on that one. And, here's something that somebody sent along as well. Just want to sneak this one in before the weekend. LGBTQ book ban proponent faces felony child molestation charge in Missouri. I saw that story the other day. We can bookend the whole thing about crazy reactions to LGBTQ-themed graphic novels. That was another book at issue in Kansas City, and it turns out that the 29-year-old parent who came to object to it has since been arraigned on child molestation charges.
Radio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
In fact, this was the guy who had said in his protest against the book at some point that only I have the intimate knowledge of what would be appropriate for my children. Well, he knows some intimate knowledge of some children. That part is true anyway. We'll get back to that and more when we return on Monday, but for now, the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam is next. Stay tuned.